Frost bit through my gloves that morning, so sharp it felt like the air itself was listening. The generator behind the tent coughed once, then settled into a low hum, a heartbeat in the stillness of December 1944. We'd been up all night, tracing troop movements on maps already smudged with coffee and exhaustion. Outside, the forest held its breath. Even the birds seemed to know what was coming, though no one would name it yet. They told us we were support, not strategy. A tidy phrase for being sidelined. Intelligence didn't win medals, it just prevented the wrong people from losing them. Still, our data was clean: convoy frequencies, decoded routes, weather reports that could cut through any fog. But when I brought it to command, they waved it off like smoke. "Good work, Lieutenant," the colonel said, eyes already drifting to someone with more decoration than results. There's a particular sound when a room of men dismisses you. It isn't laughter or words. It's the quiet clicking of typewriters resuming, the shuffle of papers reminding you that you don't belong at the table. That silence became my measure of power. How much I could hold it, how precisely I could use it. We rationed everything that week: fuel, sugar, even warmth. My men traded cigarettes for extra coffee rations. I traded patience for precision. Every report we sent vanished into the bureaucratic fog. Each one marked received, but never answered. Still, we kept filing them, dated and signed, as if persistence could break protocol. At night, I'd listen to the generator sputter through the cold and imagine the sound carrying past the trees, into enemy lines. We were so close to the truth it hurt to keep still. But we did. Waiting was an order, and orders were a kind of faith. When dawn came, I stood outside the tent, frost cracking beneath my boots, and looked toward the ridge where the horizon split between pale light and shadow. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made without us. They said the plan was clear. But the silence before it wasn't peace, it was blindness. We were told to wait. We didn't. By dusk, the mail truck finally reached our outpost, its wheels crusted with ice, headlights dimmed against blackout rules. The driver handed me a stack of sealed envelopes, each one marked with the same fading stamp: GHQ, priority. Inside, I found ours, thick and heavy, the paper warped by damp. The return code didn't match the usual routing from Intelligence Command. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. By the second page, I knew it wasn't. The orders were a ghost dated 3 days earlier, signed but never logged. Our reconnaissance directive had been temporarily reassigned to another unit, one already favored by command. Every reference to our findings, our decoded transmissions, our supply data was missing. As if we had never existed. I spread the papers across the desk, listening to the hum of the radio fade into static. Silence again, but sharper this time. It wasn't the quiet of distance, it was the quiet of being erased. The colonel's signature was neat, almost delicate. I could picture him back at headquarters, desk polished, uniform pressed, reputation spotless. He wasn't cruel, not even careless. Just afraid. A man like that didn't fear the enemy, he feared a mistake with his name attached. Our intelligence, if wrong, could humiliate him. If right, it could overshadow him. Either way, we were a liability. Obedience demanded I burn the papers and wait for new orders. Integrity demanded something else. I turned the envelope over in my hands, tracing the crease of the seal, feeling the weight of both choices. It wasn't anger that settled in me, it was clarity. We wouldn't speak louder. We'd move smarter. That night, I rewrote the orders by lantern light, copying every line except the routing code. I filed them where no one would look, in the local supply manifest, folded between fuel allocations and rations for the mess hall. If anyone searched, they'd find logistics, not treason. Outside, snow began to fall, the flakes whispering against the tent canvas like Morse code. I kept the radio on low, listening to the static rise and fade, the way one listens to a confession half-heard. Somewhere between the noise, I imagined the colonel's voice, steady, practiced, self-preserving, and I almost pitied him. Almost. When morning came, I sealed the rewritten packet and logged it under routine. Then I poured myself a cup of bitter coffee and stared at the blank transmission sheet beside it. We were off the record now and off the leash. The snow deepened by the hour, swallowing tire tracks and footsteps until the whole forest looked untouched, like no one had ever been foolish enough to fight here. We'd been stationed near Bastogne for 2 weeks, though stationed was generous. Cut off from main supply, radio lines frozen, and rations running low, it felt less like deployment and more like exile. Command's last message had promised a resupply within 48 hours. That was 6 days ago. Our camp sat in the shadow of the pines, the tents sagging under ice, canvas stiff with frost. We'd stripped the trucks for spare batteries to keep the signal equipment alive, and when those failed, we went silent. Every night, I lit a small oil lamp, a dull yellow glow swallowed by the dark. That light became our axis, our proof that we still existed. The men called it the ghost's candle. To me, it was defiance. Past valor had a way of echoing louder than present need. The medals on my chest had once opened doors, but now they only reminded me how fast recognition fades when it's inconvenient. A year ago, I'd been the officer who cracked the Rhine cipher. Now, I was the officer left behind with a team of 12 and half a barrel of fuel. The army loved heroes, but not when they were still alive to contradict the story. We mapped by candlelight, each flicker warping the lines like a living thing. The silence was so heavy it carried shape, broken only by the distant percussion of artillery somewhere beyond the ridge. It was a sound that reminded us the war went on without us. Men who'd once volunteered for every forward mission now stared at their boots, counting the days by cigarette ends. Our last supply request had vanished in transmission. No field medic, no spare radio parts, no fresh uniforms. Just the same static looping through the receiver, a hollow pulse in the cold. I filed reports anyway, signing them as if command might one day notice the discipline of persistence. That hope kept the men steady hope, in the knowledge that I was still watching the maps, still tracing lines no one had asked me to trace. One night, Private Lane asked what we'd do if no orders came. His voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. I told him the truth that wars are often won by those who refuse to stay forgotten. He nodded, then went back to cleaning his rifle, the gesture slow, deliberate, ritualistic. The light from our single lamp wavered across the canvas, throwing long shadows over the maps. The flicker looked almost alive, like it was breathing with us. In that glow, I realized the choice was no longer between obedience and disobedience. It was between waiting and acting. Between fading out and cutting through the dark. And in the silence that followed, I already knew which we'd choose. By the 7th night, even the air had grown brittle with waiting. The lamp hissed faintly as its oil thinned, and the snow outside pressed against the canvas like an unspoken order, stay still. But stillness, I'd learned, could be its own kind of betrayal. The silence had stretched too long. It was starting to sound like permission. Our last recorded transmission to command had gone unanswered for 72 hours. Regulations said we were to maintain silence until further instruction. Logic said silence would get us buried under the next German advance. Somewhere between those two truths, I made the choice. Not out of anger, out of precision. I pulled the transmission log from the corner of the desk. Its pages were stiff, smudged with oil and the graphite of a dozen half-erased notes. Beside it sat a weather map I'd taken from a grounded courier's jeep, edges torn where the wind had tried to claim it. Snow fronts moving south, radio interference rising with each passing hour. If we waited for orders to clear through official channels, our window would close entirely. So, I wrote a new message, short, spare, surgical. It looked routine enough, a supply request, coded with coordinates that only made sense when cross-referenced with the cipher key we'd built in secret weeks earlier. To anyone else, it would read as logistics. To those listening across the civilian relay lines, it would be an invitation, a decoy that hid the truth in plain sight. Private Lane watched me write, his breath visible in the lamplight. "Sir," he said quietly, "that's not regulation." "No," I answered, folding the page once, twice, sealing it with my thumb. "It's not." He didn't argue. The men knew the cost of silence as well as I did. We were already ghosts in the record, I was just choosing to haunt a better frequency. The old transmitter whined when I switched it on. Static filled the tent like heavy rain. I adjusted the dial until a faint civilian signal crackled through a farm network, probably used for weather reports or black market trades. My fingers hesitated only once before I pressed send. The Morse key tapped out the rhythm I'd memorized, each pulse sharp and deliberate, the sound of defiance spoken fluently in code. When it was done, I tore the transmission sheet in half and tossed it into the stove. The paper curled into ash without ceremony. The only evidence left was the false supply order I'd signed under the colonel's name as reputation now shielding our disobedience. It wasn't revenge, it was camouflage. The colonel wasn't evil, just small, a man whose fear of failure made him dangerous by omission. I'd stopped expecting courage from him. The duty, it seemed, had passed quietly to us. Sometimes, command isn't given. It's taken in silence. Have you ever chosen action over approval? Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere, far off, the faint click of returning signal whispered through the static, and I knew the storm was finally listening. By morning, the tent had turned into a paper fortress. Maps layered over maps, signal sheets curling at the edges, requisition forms spread across the floor like fallen leaves. Chaos, yes, but it was our chaos. Controlled, deliberate. Every piece of paper had a pulse if you knew where to touch it. I started with the map. The corners were held down by spent shell casings, red pushpins marking convoy routes we'd confirmed from intercepted chatter. Blue ones for enemy movements, black for the things we only suspected. A week earlier, the colonel's staff had laughed at our theoretical maneuvers. Now those same movements were closing around us. Private Lane handled the cipher keys, handwritten columns of numbers and letters that looked meaningless unless you'd lived through the nights we built them. He'd scrawled them in pencil on the backs of ration invoices, every smudge earned from frostbitten hands. The men teased him, called it his Bible. He didn't mind. Faith takes whatever form you give it. The weather officer, really just Corporal Reeves with a broken barometer and a good memory, folded the latest forecast into the plan. 3 days of cloud cover meant 3 days of concealment, but also 3 days of weak radio range. A gift and a trap, both. I wrote 72 hours at the top of the chart and circled it twice. That was our window before the encryption cycle reset and our code went dark. The plan was simple enough to survive scrutiny, but complex enough to pass for chance. Using a borrowed civilian frequency, we'd send decoy coordinates suggesting a false Allied retreat. The Germans would intercept it, reroute their forces north, and in that distraction, we'd secure the ridge, our forgotten stretch of land suddenly strategic again. Chaos versus control, two sides of the same coin, flipping constantly in my hands. Every movement in the tent had rhythm. Reeves marking the time on his watch. Lane cataloging, intercepted transmissions. The clack of the typewriter as I filled out requisition forms for fuel we'd never receive but needed on record anyway. Bureaucracy as camouflage. Every falsified form was another layer of protection. The system never suspects paperwork that looks boring enough. By the second night, the lamp's wick had burned low. Its light trembled across the map like a heartbeat, faint but steady. That flicker became our metronome, reminding us how little time remained. Then came the interruption. Just after midnight, the receiver crackled alive. Not our frequency. Not our code. The voice spoke in clipped German, low and distorted through interference. Reeves translated in fragments, his brow furrowing deeper with every phrase. Unit identified. Coordinates match. Search to continue until contact made. They weren't guessing. They knew. For a moment, no one moved. The tent seemed to shrink, the paper walls closing in with the cold. Our plan, precise, deliberate, careful, had just become a live wire. Lane reached for the transmitter, but I stopped him. Let them think they're listening, I said. We'll give them something worth hearing. So we rewrote the broadcast. This time, the false coordinates pointed east, deeper into the forest where no Allied presence could be sustained. I used the same cipher pattern, the same phrasing, the same rhythm. If they were hunting, we'd lead them exactly where we wanted them, into the snow and silence. By dawn, the men were running on coffee and adrenaline. Our 72-hour clock had already begun its count. I signed the final sheet of requisition for spare radio valves, dated and logged like any other. The kind of paper no one reads unless something goes wrong. When I finally blew out the lamp, the wick hissed once before dying. Smoke curled into the cold air, tracing its way toward the canvas ceiling. For the first time in days, the tent was dark, but the maps glowed faintly in the dim gray light creeping through the snow. Control, I thought, was never the absence of chaos. It was the ability to make chaos move to your rhythm. And we had 3 days to conduct the perfect storm. Snow muffled everything that morning, the kind of silence so complete it presses against your ribs. Even breath felt intrusive. 30 men crouched in the tree line, faces painted with ash, boots buried in frost. 4 vehicles idled behind us, engines cut, their metal skins hidden beneath branches and snowcloth. 2 radios, one functional, one just for show. That was all we had. But the ridge ahead, steep, narrow, strategic, was everything. The colonel's suppressed intel had marked this spot months earlier, a vulnerable artery in the German supply chain, dismissed as unconfirmed. He'd buried it under layers of bureaucracy, terrified of being wrong. I had kept a copy. It sat now, folded in my breast pocket, the ink softened from sweat and time. His discarded truth had become our weapon. We moved before dawn, no words exchanged, the only signals were hands, eyes, breath. Silence had turned from punishment into precision. The rhythm of our movement was measured: the soft crunch of snow, the slow exhale to steady a rifle, the brief pulse of white vapor before it vanished into air. Every man knew the plan, none had spoken it aloud since last night. Hidden verses seen, our entire fate balanced on that line. The Germans were confident, careless. Their elite unit advanced along the ridge with practiced swagger, boots striking rhythm into the snow, machine guns slung like trophies. They didn't expect ghosts. We struck first. Lane signaled with a flick of his wrist, and the first charge went off controlled, tight, clean. The explosion didn't echo, it thudded, swallowed by the snow. A vehicle slid sideways, blocking the road. 2 quick rifle bursts, then nothing. Silence again, deliberate and deafening. Reeves relayed positions over the radio, barely a whisper, his tone steady as scripture. The second team emerged from the trees, cutting the flank clean. The enemy scrambled for cover, their confidence fracturing in the cold. In that chaos, I saw what silence could do. It unsettled men trained to respond to noise. Without orders, they floundered. Without direction, they froze. The entire engagement lasted 12 minutes. 30 men, 4 vehicles, 2 radios, 1 ridge. When it ended, the snow began to fall again, covering everything: the tracks, the bodies, even the shell casings. It looked as if the forest had erased the fight before it was finished. Lane approached, helmet rim crusted white. "That's it?" he asked, voice low, almost reverent. "That's it," I said. We retrieved the fallen maps, stripped the weapons we could carry, and radioed nothing to no one. Command wasn't supposed to know we existed. We decided to honor that expectation a little longer. But word travels even in silence. By dusk, the main line had intercepted fragments of enemy transmission. Panic, confusion, a reported phantom unit striking behind their flank. Command began asking questions. When the message finally reached headquarters, it carried no name, no signature. Just coordinates and a single note: ridge secured, movement east contained. It would take the colonel another day to realize the location was the same one he'd once marked and buried. That evening, I stood on the ridge alone, the wind cutting through my coat. Below, the forest stretched quiet and endless, a white expanse swallowing history in real time. The forbidden knowledge in my pocket had rewritten the front line, and no one, not command, not the colonel, could undo it now. We lit no fires. The men slept under tarps, rifles at their sides. I stayed awake, watching the horizon fade from gray to black. Somewhere beyond that darkness, reports were being typed, names omitted, credits misplaced. But here, in the silence we'd carved from the noise, we'd done what they couldn't, we'd acted. The radio crackled, once static, then stillness. I listened until even that faded, the kind of quiet that means everything has changed. When silence finally spoke, the war listened. The first telegram from headquarters arrived 6 days after the ridge was secured. It came folded twice, the edges crisp, as if precision could disguise intent. The words were simple. Unauthorized engagement confirmed. Await inquiry. No congratulations, no acknowledgement. Just the cold grammar of discipline. By then, our boots had worn the frost into mud. The ridge held firm, the flank stable, the supply line restored, victory by every measure but the one that counted most. Permission. I knew the colonel would surface sooner or later. Men like him always did when it was safe to claim credit or assign blame. His letter came next, rerouted through London as if to acquire weight from the miles it traveled. Pending formal review of your actions, you are to refrain from further engagement. Reports to be resubmitted through proper channels. Each phrase carried the scent of self-preservation. His signature, looped and confident, might as well have been stamped "Do not embarrass me." Victory versus punishment, that was the new front line. They didn't court-martial us, at least not openly. Instead came the quieter tactics, rewritten reports where my name shifted from commanding officer to field liaison. Commendations delayed until they meant nothing. Messages lost in transmission. It was bureaucracy as warfare, bloodless, slow, relentless. I kept every document, every memo, every telegram, Every regret to inform you. They filled a small wooden crate by my cot, stacked in careful order. Proof of presence. The men joked that I was building a library of ghosts. Maybe I was. Each page was a different kind of silence, one that spoke of control maintained through omission. 6 weeks passed before the official military review convened. In that time, snow melted into slush, and new rumors began to circulate. The ridge had been fortuitously secured. The colonel's strategic foresight had anticipated the German advance. Our names were nowhere in the story. Still, I didn't write or call. Silence had become my weapon, now measured, deliberate, unnerving. Every time the colonel's aides requested an updated field summary, I sent them exactly what they asked for: dates, figures, outcomes. Nothing more. No emotion, no commentary. Just the sterile truth, stripped of flattery. It drove them mad. Reeves once asked why I didn't fight louder. "They're rewriting history," he said. "Then we'll make sure they spell it right," I told him. Eventually. The waiting was the worst part. Military reviews are never quick, especially when reputations are at stake. Paper had to travel first to Brussels, then to London, then to Washington, where men in suits would weigh what version of the story best served morale. I tracked each transfer on a small notepad, noting dates and reference numbers. The process was its own campaign, one waged in filing cabinets instead of trenches. When the final dispatch came, it was unsigned. Actions under investigation deemed tactically justified but procedurally irregular. It was the kind of sentence that meant nothing and everything. We were exonerated, but not celebrated. The colonel's name remained untouched. That night, Lane poured what was left of our whiskey into tin cups. We toasted without speaking. Outside, the forest had begun to thaw, the snow's silence replaced by the slow drip of water through branches. It sounded like the world waking up again, indifferent to the politics of men. I folded the last telegram into my coat pocket, next to the colonel's original suppressed report. Both would outlast us in some archive, eventually found by someone curious enough to wonder why two versions of the same story existed. For now, I stayed quiet. Not out of obedience but control. Sometimes the sharpest power lies not in speaking, but in making others wait for what you'll say next. The inquiry room was small enough to feel intentional. Smoke hung low in the air, not from battle this time, but from the cigarettes of men who preferred fog to clarity. A single clock ticked on the wall, too loud, too steady. It was the kind of sound meant to remind you who controlled the silence. The colonel sat opposite me, posture immaculate, metals polished to the point of reflection. He didn't meet my eyes. To his right, a tribunal officer flipped through a folder stamped "Confidential, Review of Conduct." The word conduct always made me think of orchestras, someone waving a baton, someone else following. This morning, no one seemed sure which of us held the baton. They began with accusation. Unauthorized engagement. Failure to communicate through approved channels. Endangerment of Allied assets. The list unspooled like a script written by someone who'd never seen the ridge, who'd never heard snow absorb the sound of gunfire. I let them speak, nodding where appropriate, my hands folded neatly on the table. When it was my turn, I opened the first folder. Inside were the receipts, the real kind, not metaphorical. Transmission logs with timestamps handwritten by Reeves, confirming that our messages had been sent and ignored. Copies of supply orders routed through the colonel's office, marked, deferred. A weather report attached to the original operation file, dated 2 weeks before his official plan. I placed them in a clean line on the table, one after another. "Each of these," I said, "was filed under your signature, sir." The colonel finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, but tired, the kind of tired that comes from living too long inside your own reputation. "You're implying negligence," he said softly, almost pleading. "No," I replied. "I'm describing sequence. Accusation versus evidence." Every word now weighed like coin. The tribunal officers exchanged glances, their earlier certainty thinning into discomfort. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth, presented quietly, has a way of echoing louder than outrage. I slid the final document forward. A decoded German dispatch intercepted days before our ambush, referencing an Allied movement they should not have known about. Proof of a leak, proof we had been right to act without waiting. The paper trembled slightly as it left my hand, not from nerves, but from the draft creeping under the door. The colonel read the heading, then stopped. His throat moved once before he spoke. "If the information had been wrong," he said, "the consequences would have been catastrophic. And because it was right, I answered, the consequences are inconvenient. He flinched, just barely, then straightened his cuffs. I almost pitied him. Fear of failure had hollowed him out more efficiently than any enemy bullet could. In another life, he might have been brave. The room went still. The clock ticked once, twice, then seemed to hesitate time itself, listening for what would happen next. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and stood. "We followed the mission you forgot," I said. No one replied. The silence that followed wasn't the emptiness of absence, it was the weight of recognition, heavy and final. Outside, the corridor smelled of cold metal and polish. The air felt cleaner there, thinner, like truth had opened a window. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to prove. By the time the report was amended, a full year had passed. November 1945, the war already a ghost that Europe was learning to live with. The official commendation order came folded inside a plain brown envelope, postmarked from London and stamped Archiv's copy. I opened it at my desk, where the light from a low winter sun slanted across the wood in long, uneven bands. The ink had already begun to fade, as if the truth had waited too long to be spoken. Our unit's name appeared midway through the document, no fanfare, no headlines. Just 6 lines of text noting strategic initiative under adverse conditions, and successful defense of Allied position, Ardennes sector. The language was as sterile as a medical report, but I read it twice, then once more, because it existed. That was enough. Erasure had finally given way to recognition, not through applause, but permanence. The words would live in the archives now, filed between operation codes and casualty lists. Proof, at last, that we had not imagined ourselves into history. The colonel's letter arrived 3 days later. Thicker paper, embossed seal, familiar restraint, no apology, he wasn't built for those. But there was acknowledgement in every measured line. Your actions, though irregular, contributed materially to the outcome. The record has been corrected accordingly. I traced my finger over the signature, still confident, still controlled. Yet I could hear what went unsaid, the quiet relief of a man released from his own false narrative. I didn't frame the letter. I slipped it into the same crate that once held our denied reports, now half empty. The papers inside smelled faintly of dust and old ink, the scent of battles fought without rifles. When I closed the lid, the click of the latch sounded final, like a door sealing on a chapter too long open. That night, I walked through the empty camp. The frost was back, brittle underfoot, the same as it had been before orders ever came. Dawn broke slow and pale over the horizon, the kind of light that doesn't announce itself, it simply insists on being seen. I stood there until the sun cleared the trees, warming the edge of my sleeve. For the first time, silence felt like peace, not punishment. Recognition never arrives the way you imagine. It doesn't cheer, it doesn't weep. It just sits there, steady as morning, waiting for you to notice it. We had written ourselves back into the record, one precise act at a time. And as the light grew stronger, I thought of others still waiting for their truth to surface, for someone to see what was always there. Whose story have you quietly rewritten by refusing to disappear? The ridge looks smaller now. The years have worn it down to a gentle rise above the tree line, where the wind moves without hurry and the earth no longer remembers the sound of engines. I stand where our command tent once leaned against the frost, and for a moment, I almost expect to hear the generator hum, the quiet breath of men waiting for orders that never came. But there is only wind, steady, patient, unafraid. Noise once meant chaos, now it means peace. I come here when I teach. The new officers call it orientation, but what I give them is something closer to memory. I show them how to read absence, how to listen for what isn't said in a report, how to see through the neatness of official language. They ask about medals, about victories they can point to. I tell them that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is the refusal to vanish when you are told to wait. At the base of the ridge, the light shifts through the branches, the same way it did on that morning after the storm. It catches the metal clasp of my field journal, the one I still carry though the pages are long filled. Every mark inside it, the maps, the ciphers, the fragments of names, is a proof of life, a record of what silence built. I don't bring flowers to the site. I bring the lesson. That control isn't always loud, and power isn't always seen. The wind carries the echo of everything we chose not to shout. We were never the story they expected. But history, in time, learns to listen. We were the silence that turned the tide.